Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning or good evening, whether you are here in Europe or in the Americas or in Asia. And welcome to this webinar, People Not Numbers, and Welcoming Migrants in Europe. This is the first of a series of ecumenical and international webinars on migration in Europe. I am Veronica De Sanctis, and I'm in charge of training courses, research and communication here at the Scalabrini International Migration Institute. And without further ado, I will leave the floor to Father Aldo Scoda, Director of the Scalabrini International Migration Institute and Professor of Pastoral Theology and Human Mobility at Pontifical University Urbaniana here in Rome for a welcoming speech.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. It is my pleasure to greet you all and to salute the work of this webinar, the first of the series of webinars called Migration, Ethics and Theology, an Ongoing Dialogue. An ecumenical international initiative started from the cooperation between the Scalabrini International Migration Institute in Rome and scholars in the research project Nordost, Migration and Hospitality in a Nordic Context. This ecumenical international webinar series will foster critical perspective on migration in Europe. The series facilitates an ongoing conversation on these issues among theologians and migration scholars, refugees and migrants, activists, Christian churches, and civic leaders. The initiative has the potential to provide a platform for dialogue and exchange of experiences of good practices and lessons learned among Christian communities and enhance the promotion of the human dignity, the protection of migrants and refugees' rights, regardless of their origin. This is a collective task, and first of all, I want to thank all the partners, the Faculty of Theology of the University of Oslo, Norway, the Faculty of Theology of the Åbo Academy University in Finland, the Center for Multidisciplinary Research on Religion and Society of the Uppsala University in Sweden, the Faculty of Theology of the Pontifical Urbaniana University, the Vatican City, and Scalabrini International Migration Institute in Rome, Italy. The idea of holding a series of webinars on migration in Europe stems from a number of questions we have been asking ourselves, especially in light of what has been happening on our continent from the past year with the conflict in Ukraine. How do we assess what is currently happening and how conflicts and migration are challenging European societies? How the perspective of welcoming change in Europe compared to the past? Which are the positions, reflections of Christian churches in the current European migration context? What kind of theological perspective can be promoted regarding the actual situation? And last but not least, can theology and churches represent serious challenges to the present European politics and societies, often dominated by issues of security, immigration restrictions, and populist initiatives? How to welcome, protect, promote, and integrate those fleeing war, persecution, or other causes that force people to leave their homes without distinction of nationality or origin is not only a political, but also a theological fact. Migration has indeed become a defining feature for the social, cultural, economical, political, and religious life of a world increasingly characterized by the powerful forces of globalization, as well as by ongoing conflicts and growing natural disasters. It is also a dominant theme in the media, which often stoke fears and divisions at the expense of the stories and lives of those involved. Indeed, we are witnessing a continuous public debate that uses migrants and refugees as tools to fuel division, conflict, and sometimes even hatred. The complexity and connections established around the migration phenomenon, therefore, requires special attention, vision, and commitment. The Christianity has from the very beginning sought to be an open house for all. It has always been involved in human, anthropological, and social challenges, and has always borne the burden of suffering, but also of the hopes of men and women of different times and cultures. Starting from these questions, today's webinar aims to focus on the issue and the theme people, not numbers, unwelcoming migrants in Europe. The objective is to facilitate a dialogue in an international and ecumenical perspective, as migration is indeed an opportunity for the oikumene. I trust that this first webinar will bear an abundant fruit of good works. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Father Aldo, for your welcoming speech. And now Cecilia Nantfeld from the University of Uppsala Faculty of Theology and the Åbo Academy University, that she is specialized in connecting theology and gender studies, and has a long experience of researching related to theological perspective on migration, will provide us with a very brief background for welcoming work in the Nordic countries, in Sweden, and with some stories that will help us to remember, not to forget.
Thank you very much for having me here. I will start in this saying people, not numbers. Faces, not fingerprints. Stories, not policy drafts. And this is important to me as Sweden has, since the autumn, of a new political landscape, and so possibly also Finland soon. Negotiations for a new government are ongoing. And nationalist right-wing parties are influencing social and cultural politics. The so-called Sweden Democrats are not in the government, but are supporting the Prime Minister Ulf Kristersson's conservative government, and he is depending on their support. Their influence can be seen in suggestions for more harsh legislation concerning penalties for gang-related crime, priorities in social welfare, but most of all concerning migration and culture intertwined in these. Significantly, the Director Generals of Immigration Service and of the Government Agency for International Development Cooperation are asked to resign. They will resign this summer. And there is also a decision in Sweden for a national census to count who and how many live on all addresses in Sweden. How this is to be effected in practice is discussed. It has been suggested that the police force should assist the taxation authorities doing this. In the budget, there are no extra money given to the school system that work for culture and language support. And the folk high schools are losing most support. And I could continue this telling about what things are happening that really affects lots of migrants coming to Sweden, living in Sweden since a couple of years. But this forms a background for the welcoming work that still is done in Sweden, in churches and in civil organizations, and not the least in Finland, who have received many refugees from both Ukraine and Russia during the last years. The background is quite dark concerning an unwelcoming culture that is expanding on a political level. But it's not the whole story. The story contains also the continuation of welcoming people. Changes can be made by a stroke of ink in political decisions, but it doesn't change people's views that easy. People change their strategies in networks promoting a hospitable receiving of migrants. New strategies are currently developed because they know this is about people, not numbers. It's about life stories, dreams, plans, and this is what unites us all human beings, that we hope together create a better world to live in. The reality for men and women, girls and boys on journeys towards the future does not change, even though politics change. Wars, climate changes, political repression doesn't cease to exist. Political decisions can make people's lives harder. It can make us forget the difference between people, not numbers, faces, not fingerprints, stories, not policy drafts. So it's a duty to tell stories. It's more than a duty. It's a way of living. It's a way of being alive. Stories helps us to remember. Actually, the Greek word for truth, aletheia, stands for what is not lost in the river of Lethe, the river of death. To remember is a duty not to lose things into the water, into the rivers, the seas, and the oceans. The Swedish singer Lale says so in one of her recent songs, Remembrance of an Ocean. She was born in Iran and fled with her socially and politically active family in early 80s, first to Soviet Union, to Belarus, and then to Germany, and then to Sweden and Gothenburg. Her text in the song is telling the story of the sea. When we are standing by the shore looking back, and the song says, we will see what happens. Let's see what happens of everything we left behind. Let's see what remains, because the only thing I could bring with me were to be who I am. So I don't want to be anything else. This is all I know. To be who I am. Surviving is to still be able to exist, to still have a body that is alive. A body is me, a body that can recover when necessary, that can heal, that can create new things and new days to live. I am who I am is a dense theological expression. In the story of Moses and the holy burning bush, God's name is expressed, I am who I am. In Lale's song, it's made simple. This is the starting point of all creative work forming new life. It's something no one can take from her. It's a treasure. And her song shows strength. At the same time, there is also a darker tone. And the song continues. And we say it was meant to be, but can you call it that? When there are those who never came ashore. Yes, we can say it was meant to be. Yes, we can call it like that. All of us standing here on land. Yes, here lies the memory of an ocean in us who was left. Who can stand on land in us who remain. So is there a meaning? So many loved ones did not make it. Lale can't say that. There is no meaning for her. She addresses the meaning making to all standing at the shore, to survivors, observers, rescue teams, researchers maybe. Here lives the memory of an ocean in us who was left, that can stand on land, remaining, starting the stories in I am who I am, and this is my story. These are the faces, persons I remember. And Lale tells the stories in the songs. We do it in different ways. She records the music and words, she performs the memories, so that new stories are woven into the threads almost lost in the sea. Made alive when she sings, we can see faces, we can be sad. And it's a way of meaning making. It's not left by the shores, it continues, it follows persons into new lives in new places. The standing by a sea, a lake, or a river are theologically an important positions. There are the places where Jesus were cooking fish for his friends, that have been out all night at the sea. The shore is also the place where Jacob met God and was fighting until early dawn, being hurt and blessed. And reaching the shore are the first step for the people of God, reaching freedom after years of slavery. And one can continue lots of examples from the biblical texts. We are still on the shores, surviving, meeting friends, meeting God, reaching for freedom. So this webinar series could be called From the Shores, or From the Woods, or the Mountains, or other border crossings. There are so many routes. And yes, sometimes we do need to count and to keep records and do political work. But numbers tend to forget what is actually lost, the face of the human being. Her stories, her favorite things, what made him laugh or cry. And this webinar series is a meeting place to tell stories of a different kind than numbers. From many places and people, in many moods and stories of life. Keeping in mind that it is a duty to tell stories, to keep us all alive. Keep us even sacred, to retell of everyone I am who I am. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cecilia, for diving into stories and people, reminding us that it's not just statistical data. And from a reflection on stories, we'll move to our reflections on politics. And from the Nordic countries, we will move to the Mediterranean, to Italy, particularly with focus, which is a bridge. Italy is a bridge for many migrants to enter Europe. So we now focus on Italian policies on migration as a challenge for Europe with Oliviero Forti. Oliviero Forti has been dealing with human mobility issues for over 20 years, first as a researcher and consultant for several Italian universities, then engaging in institutional and advocacy activities at national and international level. He is currently head of migration policies and international protection office of Caritas Italiana, and currently involved in the implementation of humanitarian operations from Africa and the Middle East. Now we'll leave the floor to Oliviero and his presentation.
Okay, thank you so much for inviting me to this very interesting panel on migration. And I want to thank in advance Veronica for helping me to manage the slide who I'm going to present you. So I'm sorry, but I have to start with numbers about migration in Italy. And I have not very interesting story as my colleague did before me, but I'm trying to present you the Italian situation in the framework of European policies on migration. Probably you know that Italy, due to its central position in the Mediterranean Sea, represents one of the first countries reached by immigrants in the attempt to arrive in Europe. In the last decades, immigration figures have fluctuated. In the early 90s, refugees from Balkans and North Africa represented the largest immigration flows to Italy. After the fall, of communism in Albania in 1990, the Albanian immigration to Italy grew significantly. Indeed, nowadays, Albanian residents in Italy represent the second largest foreign population in the country. The first one are Romanians. Similarly, Moroccans are also among the largest foreign communities in Italy. So please, the next slide. In the years between 2010 and 2022, the number of immigrants who arrived by sea in Italy peaked in 2016. That year, the country recorded 181,000 arrivals. In particular, in the month of October 2016, 27,400 individuals reached the Italian coast by crossing the Mediterranean Sea. Afterwards, this figure experienced a decrease. During 2022, the number of arrivals reached 104,000. Geographically, South Italian ports were mostly affected by the arrivals. The Italian island of Lampedusa is also a major European entry port for immigrants' arrival from North Africa. In fact, this Sicilian island is geographically closer to the North African continent than to Italy. Next slide, please. Figures on the nationalities declared upon arrival reveal that Africa and South Asia are among the most frequent origin countries for immigrants. More specifically, in 2023, Ivory Coast, Guinea, Bangladesh, and Tunisia were the four most common countries of origin. Indeed, arrivals from Africa, Middle East, and South Asia make up the highest share of nationalities receiving refugee status in Italy. A look at the continent-specific asylum data shows that Pakistani, Bangladeshi, and the Indian are the most frequent citizenship of asylum seekers from Asia. Among asylum applications made by people originating from the Middle East, the most common places of origin are Iraq, Egypt, and Afghanistan. A number of applications made in Italy are submitted by Latin Americans as well. The highest number of asylum seekers from Latin America come from El Salvador, Peru, Venezuela, and Colombia. Next slide, please. The sea routes undertaken by migrants to reach Europe are extremely risky. The Mediterranean Sea recorded the largest number of deaths and missing cases of people who migrated worldwide. However, recording the deaths in the Mediterranean Sea represents a challenge. It was estimated that between 2014 and 2018, about 12,000 people who drowned while on this migration route were never found. According to recent data, in 2020, about 1,000 migrants died while crossing the Mediterranean Sea. In 2019, the number of deaths equated to 1.9 thousand, but 2016 was the year in which the number of fatalities peaked. Probably you know that a few weeks ago, Italy faced a new tragedy in Cutro, in the south of Italy, in the Calabria region, where more than 90 migrants died. More than 90 migrants died. Next slide, please. Over the past decade, in Italy and in Europe, the right-wing populist parties have made the issue of migration a key element of their respective political platforms. Since the so-called EU migration crisis of 2015-16, the European public discourse has been focused on the lack of EU-wide solidarity towards frontline member states or the absence of a broader strategy to tackle the issue in the medium to long-term perspective. Short-term fixes still dominate Europe's approach to irregular migration flows. Despite some efforts at EU level, such as the 2015 Valletta Summit on Migration or the 2020 communication on the Commission on a new pact on migration and asylum, Europe failed to respond to the multiple challenges that migration flows are bringing to the countries of first arrival. The need to propose structural reforms capable of providing legal pathways for migrants to safely reach Europe have been disattended, except for the waves of Ukrainian refugees after Russian invasion of Ukraine. The treatment and acceptance of Ukrainian refugees across Europe compared to those from Africa or Middle East is not comparable. This showed definitively a significant double standards of EU migration policy and a de facto discrimination in the implementation of migration policies. In Italy, far-right parties framed the debate around migration in terms of threats and security. Our Prime Minister Meloni adopted an extreme rhetoric promising to enforce a naval blockade to prevent migrants from reaching Italian shores, knowing that such a measure is unfeasible and in contradiction of international and EU law. The first decree voted by the Italian Parliament in 2023 has been a law against the NGOs involved in a search and rescue operation. Furthermore, during these weeks, the Parliament is going to vote a new law for weakening the refugee protection. Such restrictive approach to migration is not only in Italy, but as my colleagues told us before me, but even in other EU countries as well. There would be many examples: Poland, Hungary, Croatia, but even Sweden. European member states still refusing to embrace a EU-wide migration policy based on the principles of solidarity. No one is willing to sacrifice its national sovereignty. The frontline governments prefer to use cliché and strong criticism of the EU for failing to provide adequate financial support to such states. Finally, real problem is the lack of policy vision and political will. In Italy, the debate on migration and immigrants is full of contradictions. For example, the counter-narratives about the need for Italy to allow regular flows of migrant workers and integrate them in order to make the welfare state sustainable have fallen until now. Another contradiction is taking place in Europe as a result of the difficult relations between Russia and Europe. In the winter of 2021, between 2,000 and 4,000 migrants from Middle East were forced to camp out on the Belarus-Poland border for weeks on end, leading to multiple deaths. While this situation was the result of a strategy that aimed to weaponize migration by Belarus and Russia, the treatment that migrants receive from Poland in particular has been unacceptable, in stark contrast with the one granted to the millions of Ukrainian asylum seekers who receive temporary protection thanks to the 51 directive. As you probably know, similar mechanisms were not activated or even debated for migrants from other states, even in the midst of the so-called migration crisis of the Balkan route in 2015-16. This double standard has fed into a narrative also in Italy, whereby it would be necessary and required to distinguish between real and fake asylum seekers. Needless to say that the real ones are Ukrainian, European, the rest of asylum seekers are fake. Next slide, please. The main concern for Italian government and Europe is how to stop the fake asylum seekers who are trying to reach Italy and Europe. The only way is the implementation of externalization policies. What does it mean? The term externalization is used to describe the extensions of border and migration controls to the neighboring so-called transit countries with the aim to diminish migration and refugee flows. It refers to a wide range of practices from controls of border rescue operations to measures addressing the drivers of migration. During the last years, many EU countries, such as US and Australia, implemented externalization policies transferring border controls and migration management to transit countries. An example are the MOU signed by Italy and Libya and Niger in order to stop migration flows from North Africa to Italy. In addition to this effort to stop migration flows, they use also the instrumentalization of development assistance such as EU development aid for migration policy. But the available evidence suggests that conditionality in the provision of development aid is not effective in reducing the propensity to migrate. The externalization of border policies is contributing to immobilize a growing numbers of migrants who are being forcibly during or even before their migratory project. These policy initiatives potentially result in immobilizing would-be migrants in their countries of origin or along the way in so-called transit countries and select and filter those migrants considered adequate for further mobility. The famous Australian sociologist Stephen Castles, already in 2010, underlined that the externalization measures in international migration policies are often framed in cost efficiency terms. Politicians declare that the political, social, and economic cost of migration should be transferred to third parties, generally located far away from the country of final destination. This kind of economic approach in migration management frames migrants primarily as a burden for receiving countries rather than as a part of a positive social change in both sending and receiving societies. However, this kind of externalization talk also provides a political justification for the transfer of moral responsibility for migrants' well-being from states in destination countries to actors on the national or local levels in origin countries or transit spaces. In order to discourage the migration flows to Europe, next slide please, the Italian and European tendency is to implement externalization policies. In this way, migrants and refugees are not able to move from their countries of origin, or they are stuck in third countries from where they try to live in a very risky way. However, there are legal and safe pathways to reach Europe. It would be important to open a public debate on these opportunities as counter-narrative to the secularization policies who are often presented as the only way for migration management. The first, I think the most important instrument in this way are the employment pathways, otherwise known as labor mobility opportunities, are safe and regulated avenues that allow migrant workers to enter or stay in another country to work, providing them with the right to either permanent or temporary residence. Thanks to these pathways, workers can be safely admitted to a third country based on a concrete job offer or specific sector labor shortages while having their rights safeguarded. Unfortunately, in Europe, there are few opportunities for legal admittance of worker migrants who are obliged to migrate in an illegal way, and often they are occupied in the black market. Another important legal pathway is family reunification. When migrants and refugees leave their countries, they are separated from their family members and may go for years without seeing their loved ones or never be reunited again. Family reunification procedures are based on the legal right to family unity. In contrast to all other third country solutions, such as resettlement, education, and labor, states have a legal responsibility to put in place legal frameworks that enable family reunification. States should facilitate family reunification in order to establish the safe and legal routes necessary to prevent migrants and refugees from resorting to dangerous and irregular journeys. Effective family reunification procedures can prevent smuggling networks abusing the migrants and refugees' need to join their families. In practice, several practical, legal, and financial Barriers, unfortunately, continue to preclude migrants and refugee families from being reunited. Family reunification procedures can be complex. Some countries, for example, impose application fees, whereas sometimes limited embassy presence in a host country. Family members may be asked to travel to neighboring countries or regions for different stages of the application process. Another legal admission is the education pathways are safe and regulated admission avenues by which migrants can move to a third country to study. Developed by civil society, universities, and government actors, these opportunities can provide migrants and refugees with the required skills to support themselves. These opportunities contribute to beneficiaries' economic and social empowerment while increasing their agency and self-reliance. At the same time, they benefit host communities and institutions with a more prosperous academic environment, enhanced social cohesion, and improved academic infrastructure and resources. The last one, but not least, is the humanitarian pathways referred to programs designed to offer a pathway for admission to individuals in need of international protection through their identification and transfer from the country of asylum to a third country where they can enjoy adequate protection. These programs are often an expedited process used for persons in urgent need. Admitted individuals are sometimes provided with the opportunity to apply for asylum after arrival, including expedited procedures and humanitarian visas. In other instances, programs may provide a protection status upon arrival. Either under the formal humanitarian visas or humanitarian admission programs, humanitarian pathways can serve as a valuable tool in cases of mass displacement, for example, in Afghanistan, where there is a great need to provide effective protection to a significant number of people within a short period of time. So, in conclusion, far-sighted European and national policies are needed to manage entry flows via legal channels, which means safe pathways that avoid dangerous sea voyages for people leaving their home countries due to hunger and violence. The Italian Institute for International Affairs reminds us that migration is not a passing phenomenon and will therefore continue to impact the political scene in Italy and in Europe. There is an urgent need to deflate the politicization and securitization of migration. Real, non-ideological reforms and a long-term migration policy will require an EU-level system to manage migratory fluxes based on shared resources and responsibilities. A transparent policy on different paths to reside within the EU would be a good place to start. Thank you.
So thank you very much to Olivier Forti for his detailed presentation on Italian policies on migration and for his conclusion about several possible alternative pathways to legal migration. And then we move forward with Davide Pignata, which is his report from the field for Agenzia Scalabriniana per la Cooperazione e lo Sviluppo, the Scalabrinian Agency for Development Cooperation, ASCS Onlus, which is an NGO that operates in the area of integral welcoming, intercultural engagement, and development cooperation, both in Europe and in Africa. Davide is a philosophy major and graduate student in civil and sustainable economics. And since October 2022, he has been the contact person of Scalabrinian Agency for the Borders Project. Davide, please.
Thank you, Veronica, and good evening to everyone. Today, I would like to present to you some common elements of various border areas along the migration routes towards the Fortress Europe, towards the European Union countries. To do so, I would like to start with a quotation by Scalabrini, which is the founder of the Scalabrinian congregation. He was a bishop, an Italian bishop, and this quotation also help us to understand which is the vision of ASCS, which is as Veronica told you before, is the operational branch of the Scalabrinian congregation. So the vision regarding human mobility and border areas. So the vision leads to consider human mobility as a natural right that must be universally respected. As Scalabrini wrote in one of his letters, I quote, "Immigration is a natural right, and the human being must be able to seek his well-being in the place he considers best." End of quotation. So starting from this point of view, the question is, why is it important for the Scalabrinian congregation and for ASCS to be at the borders? Because in various border areas, this sentence, this phrase is not respected. The freedom of movement is not respected. So because of this, also in October 2022, we started the Borders Project, which aims to expand the Scalabrinian presence at the hot borders of European migration routes. In particular, 3 areas are the ones that are mostly focused, the focuses of our project. The first area is the migratory Balkan route. The second focus regards the Italian internal borders, in particular the border between Slovenia and Italy, the border of Italy with Austria, and finally the borders between France and Italy. And the third focus of our project are 2 places, 2 border cities, in particular Calais and Ceuta. Ceuta in Spain, close to the border with Morocco, and Calais in France, close to the border with United Kingdom. And these 2 cities are places in which the Scalabrinian congregation decided to open 2 new missions in order to support the people on the move that pass through these border areas. So today, I would like to highlight 3 aspects that are common to the various borders we have been on so far. These 3 elements are 3 elements that depict a situation of expulsion and exclusions operated by European Union countries. The first element, as also Oliviero Forti described before, is the externalization of borders. The second is the militarization of borders, and the third is the local hostility against the people on the move. So Oliviero Forti already described the externalization of borders and mentioned also the example of the agreements between Italy, Libya, and Niger. I can only mention one more example, which is the deal signed by a group of European Union countries and Turkey along the Balkan route in 2016, according to which the European Union countries sponsor 6 billion euro to Turkey in order to keep people from reaching Greece and Bulgaria. Yes, this is another example of externalization of borders in a non-European Union country. We move to the second pillar of this logic, which is the militarization of borders. And by militarization of borders, we mean the process of fortifying the internal and external European borders. So militarization passes through the construction of thousands of kilometers of walls between borders, between countries. This is a picture we took in Serbia, close to the border with Hungary, where you can find the 300 kilometers of wall between Hungary, Serbia, and Croatia. And the militarization of borders also passes through the development and the use of sophisticated technologies, such as biometrical recognition systems, drones, and cameras that help the police officers, the border police officers, to detect the people on the move that try to cross the borders in order to push them back. So in the case of the picture in the photo, the Hungarian police, supported by the technologies I mentioned before, operates hundreds of pushback every day against the people on the move that try to cross this border. And normally, the pushbacks are implemented with the use of violence. Here, I put a slide, a screenshot of one report of the Border Violence Monitoring Network that work in the aiming to report all the pushbacks that happen along the Balkan route and also in other border areas. And as you can read in the title of this slide, it reports the pushback that happened, a pushback that happened between Bosnia and Croatia. And it happened with the use of violence by police officers. So pushbacks basically are violent practices implemented by public order authorities against foreigners who attempt to enter the territory of a state without having the permission of entering the territory of a state. And the pushbacks are an illegal practice, not only because they are often implemented with the use of violence, but because they imply the violation of the non-refoulement principle and the rights to asylum, which are two fundamental pillars of international law. Moving to the third pillar, which is local hostility against people on the move. Because when people on the move are pushed back from a European Union country to a non-European Union country, normally they do not find a welcoming situation. This picture was taken in Serbia, in Subotica, close to the border with Hungary. And you can see people on the move normally don't have the spaces, the places in which they can sleep. They can spend their days before trying to cross again the border. So they are forced to sleep in abandoned houses, in informal camps, and often the police, the Serbian police in this case, evict the people that live inside these informal camps. This is the case of the picture you see in the slide, because we visited these informal camps in November 2022, and a few days after we were there, the camp was destroyed, and the tents that made it up were broken into pieces by police officers. And the people that lived inside the tents were deported to the southern Serbia. So yeah, this just as a story of an example of this hostility of local authorities against people on the move along the Balkan route. Another example in another place that is a symbol of local hostility against people on the move is Calais, which is in the northern France, from where tens of thousands of people try to leave the European Union for the UK each year. And most people try to reach the UK using small boats. And this is also a militarized border, because crossing this border is very complicated. So the people are pushed back and they are forced to stay in cities like Calais, like Dunkirk. And there also they often find an hostile attitude from local authorities. This photo is an example of this. You can see these big stones that the city mayor decided to put in some places in the city center to prevent people on the move from pitching their tents while waiting to leave for the United Kingdom. So you can, when you walk in the street of Calais, you can see these big stones in places where people on the move were used to pitch their tents. So this hostile environment is a common element of various border areas we visited so far. So the border context I described to you is therefore a place of violence, of pushbacks and violation of rights. But despite this, there are also people who every day try to witness an alternative approach, like the people whose faces you see in these photos. And so I would like to conclude showing the faces of people that every day testify, every day witness an alternative approach. So an approach of care, an approach of welcoming against the approach of externalization and expulsion I described earlier. And as ASCS, we try to support them in all these border areas. Thank you for the attention.
Thank you, Davide. Thank you, Davide, for your testimony, for your witness from the field. It's a very interesting and very hard picture from the field. Now I would like to leave the floor to Gioacchino Campese, a member of the Scalabrinian congregation, also currently serving as professor of theology of human mobility at the Pontifical Urbana University here in Rome, and working with the Scalabrini International Migration Institute, and also president of the ASCS, the Scalabrini Agency for Cooperation, Development Cooperation. Gioacchino will leave us with a closing reflection on the topic of today's webinar. Thank you, Gioacchino.
Warm greetings to everybody who is participating to this webinar. I am in charge of the concluding reflection, the concluding remarks, but you know, I have to say that my remarks will not conclude anything, because I think there is no conclusion here, but just the beginning, you know, of a process of reflection on this very complex and very essential issues when it comes to human mobility, because for many people, as we have heard, it is about, you know, life and death situations. We are not talking about tourism. We are talking about human mobility, and human mobility in maybe in its most tragic expression, in the most tragic dimension. I cannot offer, you know, systematic reflections on this issue, but just, you know, a few insights, starting from what has been, you know, presented by the colleagues who have spoken before me, Cecilia, Oliviero, and Davide. And I'd like to start with the witness of an African migrant who says that no parent will put their child onto a boat unless they think that the water is safer than the land. So no parent will put their child onto a boat unless they think that the water is safer than the land. Which is important, because I think this testimony, because sometimes, you know, we say, well, how do these people, you know, how come to the decision to arrive in Europe in this, you know, very through these dangerous journeys that endanger, you know, their lives and the lives of their loved ones. Maybe the answer is hope. And I want to, you know, I want to underline, at least in my reflection from a Christian perspective, from a church and a theological perspective, the primacy of hope. And I will start by saying also that 10 years ago, in 2013, I participated to a meeting on the ministry with the migrants and refugees in Turin, in northern Italy, It was a meeting that was also ecumenical, and in fact, during this meeting, we had the witness. We had the story of a migrant from Congo who is a Waldensian, and this migrant, whose name is Bertin. He told us two things about his experience also with migration and with the church. And the first thing that he said is that the church and society should not consider the migrants and the refugees just as a burden to be carried by church and society. The migrants and the refugees are contributing and can contribute to the life and the well-being of our churches and our society. And that was the first important thing that he said. The second, I think it is even more important. Basically, he said that there is a gift that the church can share with the migrants. And the gift is to help the migrants, assist the migrants in dreaming and in fulfill their dreams. Dreaming and fulfilling their dreams. When he said that, to my mind came, the fact that we, the church, the Christian churches, have as a mission to proclaim the dream with the capital D. As a mission, we have the task the mission to be the spokespersons, to be the servants, to be the witnesses of the dream of the reign of God. And so while I was listening to Bertin, I was reminded of our responsibility, of our mission as Christian churches. We have to continue to proclaim and to witness to this dream with the dream of the reign of God, for which many people have died. Jesus in premis. So this is what I would like to underline first of all. And together with this, then I remembered, that some time ago I read an article by an African theologian who is teaching, I think, now in South Africa, and he was born, I think, in a refugee camp, Barnabe Nzuruni Msaba, who in 2018 he wrote this article in which he said, basically, among the other things, but the main message was the following, that the refugees are the bearers of resilient hope. And this resilient hope is the foundation of who they are and what they live for. And then starting from this, that was the other interesting continuation of his reflection, is that he said, we should change. If we start from this, we should change the famous Pauline triad that says, when we read 1 Corinthians chapter 13, verse 13, and now faith, hope, and love abide, these three. And the greatest of them, says the text, is love. And he says, no, from the perspective of the migrants, from the perspective of the refugees, the greatest of them is hope. Again, the primacy of hope. And this is why I want to return to what Cecilia was saying at the beginning. And I want to, to add something to that I am. To that expression, because we have seen in our narratives the migrants are a threat to society. The migrants often, there is hostility against them. We have to be unwelcoming to the migrants because they are a menace to our well-being. And instead, I want to continue that I am, and I would like to say that the message, if we listen closely to the lives of our brothers and sisters who are migrants and refugees, they are telling us I am a person who hopes. I am a person who dreams. And maybe, most probably we will take, we will take also that message as a reminder again of what is our mission. What is our mission? Our mission as a Christian church, again, to be the witnesses of that hope with the capital H, of the dream with the capital D. I want to finish also, and my point was to start with the primacy of hope, but without forgetting that people are suffering, without forgetting the pain and suffering of and also the death of so many people. This morning, one of the first thing that I read in the newspaper is that the Coast Guard in Tunisia was recovered the bodies of 31 or 32, I don't remember, more than 30 migrants, who had left by boat from that country. So it is something that we are seeing every day, the big danger is we get so used to that we do not reflect anymore. We do not see what is the connection between that, and our faith and our Christian faith. The connection between that and that tragic reality and our being church. Well, I don't know if I have really an answer to that, but I would like us to go beyond the fact that these people are just victims. I think that the church, our Christian churches, and our theology should make the effort to look at these people who have died, not just as victims, but as something more, and the people who are dreaming, people who were full of hope and are hoping, and this should be, one of the I would say one of the points that on which we should reflect from our Christian faith, and I offer that to you as a point of departure of a conversation that must continue, among us, especially among us, among our people and with our people, the people also who are attending, our churches, the people of faith. Because unfortunately, that hostility about which we were talking about is present also in our churches. So we have to be honest with ourselves. Hostility is toward migrants, the unwelcoming of migrants is not present just, in society. Unwelcoming of migrants is also present in our churches, and we have to recognize that, and we have to work against that. We have to work against that, and we will be able to do that only if we recognize in our brothers and sisters, migrants and refugees, people who hope, people who dream, just like any other, human being, just like any other, person who believes. For the time being, I think I have said enough, and I leave also space to any questions or observation.
Okay, Gioacchino, thank you very much for your closing remarks, as well as opening, or more than opening, open reflections. And I want to thank all our speakers and the organizers that made the webinar possible, and thank all our audience, thank all of you for being with us today. And I wanted to take this opportunity to announce that the next webinar of the series Migration, Ethics and Theology, an Ongoing Dialogue, will be held on 30 October 2023. So thank you very much again. And I wish all of you very, very good rest of the day.